Okay, here's a big question. Is private school worth the cost? It is a question that keeps plenty of people busy before, during and after they are in that school system.
What if you knew exactly how much it cost over the full 13 years? Well, in Sydney, the figure is nearing $500,000 for the private school education. The national average is about $300,000. It was released as part of a range of numbers and kind of lump sum numbers when you consider the 13 years of education, which actually look pretty scary when you put them right there. For tonight's Taking Stock, we're joined by Shane Oliver, Chief Economist at AMP Capital, and Angela Vathulkas, founder of the Small Business Party. So welcome, guys, and thanks for joining us on Taking Stock. Yeah, whichever way you decide to send your kids in their educational path. Yeah, when you actually consider as a lump sum, it's a pretty scary concept, I thought. What do you think?
Well, it's a very scary concept, and as that article said, a lot of parents get to the end of that period and say, how did we possibly afford all of that?
Exactly.
The evidence suggests, and there was another study on this, I think, released this morning or overnight, saying that the people who go to those private schools, kids who go to those private schools, tend to rank a lot higher when the results come out in terms of the HSC and so on. You see it, you know, when the Sydney Morning Herald puts that annual thing together showing the HSC results and how the schools ranked. You always see up the top, putting aside James Roos, which is a selective public school, you always see the private schools towards the top. So parents think, well, I want the best for my kids. How do I do that? If I can afford it, I send them to private school. All the evidence would suggest that if you do well in the HSC, you get to university, and if you've got a university degree in the right area, you will earn a lot more through your lifetime than if you don't have those opportunities. So I would say, yes, it is worth it. Is it fair? That's another issue.
Yes.
That's a big issue.
Totally.
But if you're an individual parent and you can afford that, then yes, it's worth it.
The numbers would suggest that's a good way to spend the money. Yeah.
So it's a horrible amount of money when you look at it as a bulk item. I mean, over 13 years is what you're paying. You know, roughly rounded up to $500,000. I would suggest that homeschool is starting to become an option for many people when they look at that. But as Shane said, you're absolutely right. Parents that pay those exorbitant fees for private school also expect or have a different expectation on what their kids are learning at school and how much they're being driven or I won't say forced, but there is a greater emphasis on making sure that all of these kids get something out of their education. Plus there's also the connectivity, because there is that relationship after where did you go to school, you're making friends, those kind of friends are probably going to have good jobs later on too, might be able to open a couple of doors for you. I'm the product of public school. I loved my school. I enjoyed it thoroughly. It is now selective. I don't correct people that when I went there, it wasn't. Bit of a bonus.
But, you know, that free public school, that free, and I say that in inverted commas, because actually when you look at some of these other figures, I mean, nothing's really free in life,
but
right?
They weren't the figures that we had when we went. And we had free university as well.
Oh, exactly. My mother...
You know, don't forget HECS now, that other...
We changed it when we thought it wasn't affordable for other people, for us to pay for it, but the baby boomers have
just don't want to pay for the next guys.
In a way that suits themselves.
Fair enough.
School fees were like $100 a year when I was at school.
And that's what they're saying.
Before you were born, but...
It's, you know, education costs, the tuition costs, uniforms, transport, devices. They're saying this is much more of a part of the family budget than it has been in the past. I want to throw up some figures on screen and we can maybe chat about them. But, yeah, it just kind of is all going one way, isn't it?
I thought another really interesting part about this is how widely the numbers vary from... Yeah, so you've got the metro versus regional, but I thought it was really interesting when you look at the difference between, say, Sydney and Melbourne, which are, upwards of 400,000, just below 500,000.
Or Tasmania and the rest of the country.
This is exactly right.
So send your kids to Tasmania is what we're saying?
Well, this is the point. So this is the point, right? So you've got median house prices significantly lower in some of the places where top education is also significantly cheaper. So our resident economist here at Taking Stock, Shane, what do you think? Is this begging people to move to places like Adelaide and Tassie even more?
Well, potentially it does. But I guess the question is whether you get the same quality of education. If you're going to a public school in New South Wales, odds are you might get a somewhat higher quality if you're paying more for it than you would in those other states. But I guess I haven't delved into that, but I think the reality is you also probably have to pay the teachers more in New South Wales. If they're located in Sydney, they have Sydney-based costs, and so naturally it's going to cost more for teachers in Sydney to live, so they should naturally get paid more, and therefore it costs more to go to those schools.
And there's a key question here, which maybe you've partly answered it with your view, Shane, but I mean, essentially, you know, someone else is saying, so basically this is saying, do you want to spend, 13 years and overall spend $300,000 by the time your kid's 18? Or should they get to 18 and you say, here's $300,000 and, you know, with, you know, various coaching, like maybe that's, let's buy a house.
I've had this same argument with my brother, and he has 3 kids, and I've said, think about how much money goes into private school, buy them something now, put it aside and see what happens, because not all kids are destined to one way. However, my eldest niece started pre-kindy today, and I have already seen this massive personality change in just the attitude, the uniform, the bag, the hat, and off she went. She just took on this whole other persona. So,
and you wouldn't get that with home education.
No. Well,
the other thing
better lunch though
is you don't have to send your child to private school for 13 years. You can go to year 6.
It's true.
That's another good point.
Yeah.
And I think that's actually a very good compromise, because my kids have gone to private schools. I was fortunate enough to be able to afford that for them, but it was I insisted that they only go there from year 7 onwards. And they still keep in touch with the friends they made in the public school system, who then, many of those kids stayed in the public school system. But mind you, I'm also
I'd like to agree with you, except these days with the way that social media is and that whole different world that it is, it used to be that case for us starting later, but it's just a different attitude now.
Pressure
it
is,
wouldn't, that pressure is horrendous on them from that very young age.
I think the other thing that really annoys me a little bit, that there is just so much pressure on the kids these days. And I used to get on my bike, ride to school. I'd go and play with my friends after school. I could go down the beach, do whatever, that sort of stuff. My kids just don't have time for that sort of stuff. So the pressure on them is just immense.
And you wouldn't let them go alone. And you wouldn't let them go alone.
Yeah, well, I'd be too worried about it, or my wife would be too worried about it, vice versa. Or they've got to study all the time. And I kind of wonder whether we are loading too much on our kids and the expectations are just way over the top.
And we turned out all right.
Yeah, exactly.
I turned out all right.
That's the debate of our next segment.
Well, exactly. This does bring us quite nicely into the next thing that we're going to talk about, which is because we're investing very heavily in our kids. But for many parents, the financial burden doesn't end when school does. So 6 out of 10 parents with adult children say that they offer financial help, according to some new research. So the question is this the way that it should be? I mean, or should you be, 18 or 20 and that's it, game's over, you're on your own now? What do you think, Angela?
And what was your experience too?
Well,
I had probably a slightly different experience to most people. So my mother asked me to leave home. I was about 30. So I was still home.
Okay, so maybe she was entitled at that point.
Well, we were all working in a family business. I was getting up at 2 o'clock in the morning. We were all travelling together. It made sense to me. And I knew I was on a good wicket. But being from a European background, my father couldn't wait to get us into debt. So from the time that we were 18, he didn't want us to have extra spending money. It was like, no, you need to think about buying a house. And you need to save your money. And he always incentivised us to save money. And once we saw what that world looked like and what we could do and become independent, that's it. We were hooked on being financially responsible. So in my opinion these days, if parents don't provide that good example of how to cope with life financially, then they are going to end up with kids who are 20 and 30 and 40, still living at home and still making them. But there's a different world now because their kids are coming back. They're leaving home, they're getting married, they're having families, they're splitting up. They're coming back home with 3 kids. It's not just the one at home anymore. They come with little ones, so don't sell the big house because you might still need it
stay there
for the grandkids.
Well, I think that financial responsibility issue is very important. My parents weren't that well off when I was growing up, and so if I wanted something, which was usually a sailing boat or something like that, I had to go and mow lawns and do gardening for elderly people, and I really loved that. I'd do a few hours of this each week, and that gave me that base of savings, and sometimes my parents would help top it up a little bit, but when I got the boat, I really looked after it because it was my savings.
You paid for it.
And I paid for a big chunk of it. They would help take it down to the water, all that sort of stuff.
Well, we looked forward to getting our first job, remember, as teenagers. 14 and 9 months, I wanted my first job.
That was a big thing.
I think I was out of the home and completely cut off financially from like 20, maybe 20, but that's because I started working full-time quite young. And I kind of did uni like sporadically on the side over many years. I did finish it in the end. But I was kind of already working full-time, which allowed me to go out and rent and then pay my own bills, insurance, health insurance, everything. But I think, you know, what you said earlier about the cost of education, and this comes back to the earlier thing, you know, cost of higher education now. Kids trying to do, you know, TAFE or, you know, on terrible wages,
So
out, you know, doing a trade or, you know, university courses.
You could end up with a $100,000, $150,000 HECS debt.
Yeah, so that's kind of a changed world in terms of people trying to stay at home longer to basically, you know, they can't afford to work full. I mean, a lot of students are trying to do it, and we've seen figures, and we've talked about them before, of people trying to work part-time and full-time study, or full-time work, full-time study. But it's pretty hard.
Something's got to give, and it's either your social life or your study.
It is pretty hard. I think partly the article was about kids who'd sort of taken advantage of their parents.
Definitely, yes.
I mean, my parents said to me, as soon as I got a full-time job, you know, you've got to pay board here, and so I did. And I think that was quite important. My
because
mother
their parents
said that
did
to me.
too, though.
Yeah, that's right.
That was an example that was set and it was accepted.
But I think I should say, my children aren't quite there yet, but I think I would have to say the same thing to my kids. If you're still here when you're 25 and you get a full-time job, you should be paying board.
Here's the house insurance.
And by the way, I've been paying your car insurance for the last
that was one of the tips. That was one of the tips in this piece. Say, make a list of the bills you pay so they even realise, because half the time it's all invisible, of course.
Exactly right. Now, we do have to move on. We've got one more thing to talk about, and not that much time to do it, but mentions of Amazon by other companies aside from Amazon has soared alongside Amazon's share price. Or, I mean, it could be the other way around. So, is there a lesson here? Do businesses make things worse for themselves by over-broadcasting their concerns that they have for a big competitor? It's kind of a big topic here, but yeah, companies who are worried about Amazon talking about it too much. What do you think?
And this is mentions, this goes over time.
This is the reason, this is the whole reason why we're talking about this. Yeah, so this is mentions, 800 mentions at the top. This is public mentions from executives or whatever, and that's the share price of Amazon.
I think the more they talk about Amazon, the bigger the divorce settlement will be, so yes.
Oh, that's a good point.
I kind of think that this just goes with the territory. When something is successful, it will attract attention to itself, and often your competitors will be talking about that thing. So it's not that unusual for this to happen. But by the same token, I don't want to overstress it. You get in this debate about the power of the media. There's an argument that house prices in Australia are falling because we're talking about it.
Yes, there is an argument about that.
Now, if life was that simple, then turn that on its head and you would argue, well, house prices were only rising because we were talking about it. Now, if it was that simple, all we had to do was stop talking about it 5 years ago. House prices would never have become unaffordable. But I don't think it is that simple. I think Amazon still would have broken through. It would still be immensely successful because people found it to be a great product. So I don't think it's the talking about it. That's gone with the fact that they've created a great product.
I agree. Just like we talk about Steve Jobs and Apple and any of those inventions, it's just Amazon is the global sensation disruptor that it is. It's phenomenal. People talk about it. People have made money out of talking about how successful Amazon is. So it comes hand in hand. Biggest compliment you can have, right?
That's right.
Yeah, that's right. Hey, Angela and Shane, thank you so much for getting across a whole range of topics when you guys join us for Taking Stock tonight included. Thank you.